this is the Libertarian Party of Saline County News, and our regular monthly meeting, the first Saturday of each month. It's our coffee and discussion at Mocha's on South 9th, and it's a very good time for you to be there because we'll discuss whatever you want to discuss. And then Libertarian Party State News, I don't have any of that now. Then the Libertarian Party National News, we've got a candidate in Philadelphia. It's Maj Tor. He's a candidate for City Council at Large in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And he's running as a Libertarian. He is a hip-hop artist and a Second Amendment advocate. So, Joey, you know about him, don't you?
Yeah, I've been following him for a couple of years now. He's been a very outspoken libertarian activist. He actually coins a lot of really catchy slogans that really either get you laughing or really get you thinking. Everything from "Make the Hood Great Again" to "All gun control is racist." He's a really outspoken advocate for inner city black communities, and he talks quite often about how liberal and democratic policies end up hurting those communities more than they end up helping them.
That's true. Well, yeah, we're glad to have people like him.
Mm-hmm.
Now, also nationally, we've got several elected libertarians, and these have all been elected to city councils, which is like our city commissioner. So Cara Schultz in Minnesota, Burnsville City, then Jim Turney in Florida, Altamont Springs, then Apollo Pazel in Utah, Copperton, and then Levi Tampin in Arizona. He's the mayor now. And then Cole Elbow in Tennessee, Carthage, and then Tessa Sitzer in Coopertown, Utah. So as I said, these are all city councils. And you know, I've mentioned before, at the local level, we're doing pretty well. You know, school board, city council, and so on. So it's very encouraging.
I don't know if it's the same Cara Schultz, but there was a Cara Schultz who was in the LNC a while back. Is that the same Cara Schultz? Yeah.
Yeah.
Was she a treasurer for the Libertarian National Committee?
I'll discuss her later.
Oh, okay.
She's one of our staff people.
Gotcha.
Let's see now. Now here's something interesting. Some of you remember Linda Chafee. He was the mayor of Warwick, Rhode Island from 93 to 99, and he was a U.S. Senator from 99 to 2007. So let's see, 8 years, and he was governor of that state from 2011 to 2015. And so he recently moved to Utah, and he's changed his registration to Libertarian. And he's really discouraged with Democrats and Republicans. And he wrote an opinion piece for the Boston Globe in July describing why he joined the Libertarian Party. And if you want to read that article, just Google Chafee Libertarian Party and you'll get that. So I think he's the highest level person I know of who's changed to our party.
Mm-hmm. Unless you want to count Gary Johnson.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Johnson was a governor, and Chafee was a governor.
I wonder if Chafee was inspired by Glenn Beck at all, because I know him and Glenn Beck are pretty good friends.
Oh.
And Glenn Beck has recently, in the last few years, declared himself a libertarian. So I don't know if he's a Libertarian Party person, but...
Yeah, I used to watch Glenn Beck on TV, and then he went off for some reason.
He started his own network.
Yeah. Now, going back to that woman you mentioned, in Burnsville, Minnesota, women hold most of the leadership positions, you know, mayor, chief of police, and city council. So Cara Schultz is one of them, and she's that woman I mentioned who's the Burnsville, Minnesota City Council. And also, she's the Libertarian National Committee candidate recruiting specialist. So she's one of the paid employees. And, I don't know how she does that. Apparently she lives in Minnesota, but the LNC headquarters is back east. So, so maybe, I don't know, maybe she stays in her home and works by computer. Okay, but the interesting thing is that Kara and several other women, they were featured on NBC's Today Show. So they were interviewed by this NBC Today Show host, and so that's really interesting.
Was that the one where the whole city council was all women?
Yeah,
Yeah.
there were 6 or 8 women. And, yeah,
I remember that one.
yeah, I have a picture of that. Okay, now other national news. I like to read studies of different things. So here's something from the Cato Institute, and that's a libertarian organization. Yeah. Cato is very well known libertarian organization, and here's a 2016 study. Now you may say to yourself, well, this is 2019, but it takes years to gather data on things. So this is probably their latest study. So what they did, Cato, they examined different things and they rated the state. For example, the state tax burden, Alaska has the lowest state tax rate. And you see that 2.74, that's the way Cato, the formula they use to calculate these things. So it doesn't really mean much to us.
It's not specifically the tax rate, but it's the score that Cato
Yeah,
attributes.
that's right. Yeah, the 2.74 is the Cato score, however they did that. But Alaska has the lowest tax rate, state tax rate of all the states. And Alaska has a lot of oil, and I read years ago that every year each citizen in Alaska is given thousands of dollars from their oil revenue. So somehow they apportion that oil money. So it's understandable they have a low tax rate. And then you see Hawaii is the highest tax rate. And of course, Hawaii is a very expensive state, the housing and everything, and I'm not surprised. And Kansas is number 24 out of 50. So we're
right in the middle.
Yeah, we're in the middle. So our state tax burden is sort of in the middle. And then spending on government operations, like the state, who do they, their salaries and their goods and services for the state use. So here again, Kansas is sort of in the middle, and Wyoming is the lowest, the least spending. And that makes sense because Wyoming is basically a rural state, a lot of ranches and less than 500,000 population. So they wouldn't have a lot of government. And then Pennsylvania is the highest for some reason. I'm not sure why that is. Okay, now the tax burden, let's see, local tax burden, that would be your city, county, taxes and so on. And here again, Kansas is sort of in the middle, and New York has the lowest tax burden. Now, I really don't understand that because a lot of people are moving out of New York because of taxes. So some of their New York taxes must be really high.
Probably the state taxes are really high.
Yeah, so these are the local, like your maybe your real estate taxes and city and so on. Those are so New York is the lowest there. And then Vermont's the highest for some reason. Okay, now government employment. So how many government workers are there? Well, Nevada is the highest. It has the most employees. And that makes sense because, Las Vegas, all these gambling casinos, and they are highly regulated. And there, no doubt there are all kinds of state employees to watch them. So that makes sense.
Nevada also has the highest percentage of government-owned land.
Oh,
than any other
yeah,
state.
that's,
So there's a lot of military bases and military property that could be a part of it too.
yeah. And then here again, Wyoming, that low population state, it's got the least government employees. So Wyoming seems to be a pretty good place to live. Okay, now, the next category, land use freedom, and this indicates like, how can you develop land? Like, for example, several years ago, I was a member of the Saline County County Board, and we approved building developments in the rural areas. So how easy, say if you're a developer, how easy is it for you to develop land, land use freedom? So here again, you see Kansas is number 6. That's pretty good. Now, Alabama's the best. Now, here again, I don't know why that is. And then the worst, in terms of land use freedom, is New Jersey. And of course, I've read about New Jersey. It's a highly populated state and lots of regulations and highly unionized. So, I imagine in New Jersey, if you want to start a new housing development, you have to go through all kinds of paperwork and stuff.
I've heard jokes from people who live in New Jersey when they see grass. It's like the first time they see the ocean. They don't know what grass looks like.
Yeah. And then the labor market freedom. Now, this relates to the workers and how much freedom do they have. And Texas has the best labor market freedom. And Texas is a right-to-work state, so they've got lots of oil refineries there, and they've got a lot of good jobs. So Texas is the best state probably for employees. And Kansas, we're pretty good. We're number 6, you see. And then California, that's the worst state for labor market freedom. And I can believe that because California has all kinds of regulations and environmental things. The Democrats, you can't do this and that. And it's probably a union state. You have to belong to it.
Most definitely.
Yeah, have to belong to a union to get a job.
It's very uncommon in California for high schoolers to have jobs.
Oh, is it really?
Yep.
That's too bad. Let's see now, the overall regulatory policy score. So this is regulations. I guess it's business, land, things like that. So Kansas is the best. So we have the least regulations overall. And here again, New York is the worst. New York has the big cities and a lot of regulations. Okay, then now the overall economic freedom score, Florida is the best because Florida has no state tax. Economic freedom, that relates to the taxes you pay. Yeah, a lot of people from New York, they move down to Florida because there's no state tax. And I think also Wyoming or Utah, they don't have any state tax either. So anyway, the economic freedom, Florida is the best state, and there's no state tax. And Kansas is 13th, so we're not so bad. And here again, New York is the worst.
Stay out of New York, people.
Yeah. And the gun rights score, this is really interesting. Kansas has the best gun rights score. And of course, all you have to do in Kansas is if you obtain a handgun, you can carry it outside your clothing, under your clothing. You don't need a permit. You don't need any kind of training. So Kansas is really an open state. as far as handguns go.
What a lawless Wild West state we
Yeah,
are.
you'd think we'd be shooting people all the time. But you never hear about that, do you? And then the worst states, 49 California and Hawaii 50. And so, okay. Yeah, that's interesting that the states with the best gun rights scores, like Kansas and, Wyoming and Utah, those are pretty much open carry states, but there's very little shooting or crime like that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, let's see. Joey, do you have anything you want to discuss? Anything?
I could discuss anything you want. I have nothing in particular.
No,
I want
okay.
to, though.
Yeah, well, now from now on, if you give me something ahead of time, I'll
Yeah.
be glad to add it. Now, let's see. Since we're going over different studies, let's go over this supplement sheet. And here's an index of economic freedom. And the Heritage Foundation did this study. And of course, I get their email sometimes, but Heritage Foundation is very well known. And economic freedom, that relates to how much capitalism do you have and free market and stuff like that. Hong Kong has the best ranking, #1 in economic freedom. And I can believe that because you have a question? Yeah.
Oh, no, I was agreeing with you.
Yeah, because basically Hong Kong is basically a very huge city with millions of people, and it's very capitalistic, free market. And for almost 100 years, the British ruled Hong Kong. Then they gave it back to China, maybe 20 years ago or so. So actually China has a good deal of control over Hong Kong. And you've probably read in the paper about the protests of the Hong Kong citizens.
It's interesting, though, because the Chinese government, for the most part, has left Hong Kong alone and let them be autonomous. Because
Yeah.
most people know the Chinese government is a very communistic government, but Hong Kong is the most capitalist city in the
Yeah.
world. And I think that's because Hong Kong does so good economically, it more or less supports a lot of the government of China. So they left them alone until
Yeah.
recently, when they're trying to extradite criminals.
And China has gone somewhat capitalistic. So you're
Yeah.
right. It has a communistic central government, but
Yeah.
they permit a lot of capitalism.
They have been allowing a little bit more capitalism to come
Yeah.
in.
And then you can see some of the other states with economic freedom, Singapore, New Zealand. So those are,
New Zealand kind of surprises me.
yeah. New Zealand is socialist, and Canada's socialist. But Canada, I guess they have a pretty free market system.
Canada's very similar to America as far as economics go.
And then look, United States, our country is number 12. So of all the countries in the world, we're number 12. So we're not that great, are we?
We'd probably be #1 if it wasn't for FDR.
The worst state of economic freedom is North Korea. Of course, that's a dictatorship. And Venezuela, 179. Of course, it's socialist and their economy's ruined.
Cuba's
Cuba.
communist, China's communist, Russia's
Yeah.
kind of
So you
communist.
can, Saudi Arabia down through North Korea, all those countries, they're dictatorships. And so you can see where the central government controls things, you don't have much economic freedom. Let's look at one more thing here. The national debt is the total money owed by a country. And the GDP, the gross domestic product, that's the sum of all the goods and services a country develops. So it's sort of like debt to income. So in Greece, their debt to GDP ratio is 181%. And what that means is their debt is very high compared to what they produce. And that's a bad situation. And in recent years, Greece has had economic troubles, and they want the EU to bail them out and all that stuff. So Greece is in bad shape economically.
A lot of European countries are going to follow, though.
Yeah. And the United States, we're not doing so well either. Like in 2018, our public debt was about $20 trillion. And the debt to GDP ratio was 106%. See, so in 2018, our public debt was $20 trillion, and that was only slightly above the GDP ratio. So that's a bad situation, and it's getting worse. Like the highest debt to GDP ratio in the United States was in 1946, was 121%. So that means you spend a lot of money. A lot of money was being spent for the war effort.
Yeah.
So it's a lot higher than what you earn. So 121%. And then the lowest debt to GDP ratio in this country in 74 was 31%. So that's pretty good. And that was at the end of the Vietnam War. That war was winding down, so we weren't spending a lot of money on it. And Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan had not yet taken off. So the point is here, I say, we're going to be in trouble. And Trump has been a big disappointment because he's spending lots and lots of money. And I think, when politicians spend money, they do it to please people and win votes. So next year there's going to be a presidential election, and if Trump can spend all this money and maybe buy Greenland.
I actually think buying Greenland wouldn't be too bad of an idea. There's a lot of resources.
Yeah,
there.
it depends on what it costs. Yeah, they may have a lot of coal and whatever. Okay, well, that's all of our news for tonight, and stay tuned for another Libertarian Party video, and we'll see you next month.
In Great Britain, The Economist reported on a poll recently. What they said was young Britons have turned strikingly liberal in a classical sense. They're talking about a poll. The young want Leviathan to butt out of their paychecks as well as their bedrooms. Britain's youth are not just more liberal than their elders, they are also more liberal than any previous generation. And then, you can believe this if you want to, but I read it on the internet. 81.2% of the protesters in the public square in Turkey told pollsters they were libertarian. I don't know what libertarian means in Turkey. I don't know what the actual question was, but that's what was reported on a Turkish newspaper website. So this has been fun lately, but that's all politics, and political attitudes can change. And what's important for us here at the Cato Institute, for libertarian scholars, for the libertarian movement in general, I think, is to develop and promote the principles of liberty and limited government. And in that regard, we cannot count on politicians. It's up to us, all of us broadly, but still up to us, few enough of us that we need to accept personal responsibility for this. First thing we need to talk about is what we stand for. What are the principles that we believe in? I like to use Adam Smith's phrase, the simple system of natural liberty. Make a few rules like don't hit other people and don't take their stuff, and then let people do as they will, and you get a simple system of natural liberty. And it creates economic growth, progress that was unprecedented in the world before Adam Smith's time. Another way to put it, a more specific way, I think, is no one has the right to initiate aggression against the person or property of anyone else. That, I think, is the more specific core of libertarianism. And that, too, can be summed up as don't hit other people and don't take their stuff. That's what it means. No one has the right to initiate aggression against people who have not themselves used aggression. If we follow these rules, we get a society of progress and economic growth and a broadening standard of living, not for the rich, but for everybody, for the poor, for the middle class. And remember, everybody in the middle class was poor a couple of generations ago. That's what capitalism will do for you. And that's important. But to my mind, at least, we're not talking just about utilitarianism or better outcomes. If you just say, as a scientist, how could I improve the lot of the worst off in the United States or the world? The answer would be the rules of libertarianism. But to me, it's not just about economics. It is that we believe that people have a right to be free, that we believe that people have a right to live their lives as they choose, so long as they don't interfere with the equal rights of others. And so we are for the better outcomes that are produced, but what we're really for is freedom and limited government. Some of you may have read or seen on television the very long-standing journalist Robert Novak. He used to be on CNN and Fox toward the end of his life. He had a column in the Washington Post for 40 or 50 years. And I had an opportunity to be at a little luncheon for him when he published his memoirs not long before he died. And I remember one of the things he said there was, whenever I get invited to deliver a commencement address at a college, which is like about 1% of this, 1% as many times as all the liberal journalists get, but when I get invited to give one of the things I tell the young people is always love your country but never trust your government. That's a pretty good principle in the United States and Turkey and a lot of other places. Love your country, love the people, love its history, but don't trust the government any farther than you can throw it. It is a lesson we have to continually relearn, and some people have a lot of trouble with it. About a year ago, on the 4th of July, in America's leading newspaper, the New York Times, an author named Kurt Anderson took the occasion of Independence Day, the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, to complain at length that there's too much freedom in modern America. But he wrote some interesting things. He wrote, "For hippies and bohemians, as for business people and investors, extreme individualism has been triumphant." And reminiscing about his youth in the 60s, I guess, he said, back then, greed as well as homosexuality was a love that dared not speak its name. Then he said, what the left and right respectively love and hate are mostly flip sides of the same libertarian coin minted around 1967. Thanks to the 60s, we are all shamelessly selfish. This is what the New York Times thought would be a good way to celebrate America's birth. Well, Kurt Anderson calls it selfish. We call it self-reliance, minding your own business, staying out of unnecessary wars, and raising everybody's standard of living by pursuing your own interest and your own profit. My friend Brian Doherty, an editor at Reason magazine, wrote a great history of the libertarian movement a few years ago called Radicals for Capitalism. And in it, he makes two arguments. And they might sound like they can't be reconciled. First, he says, libertarian ideas are radical. And then he says they are deeply rooted in Western civilization, which now, quote, runs on approximately libertarian principles. Well, it's an interesting question. Can they both be true? I think they are both true. They are radical. They have challenged the established order in every era of history, and particularly in the last 500 years as they came together as a body of thought in England and the Netherlands and Western Europe and the United States. And they swept away a lot of the vestiges of the old order. Unfortunately, some of those vestiges have come back in modern guise. We got rid of the divine right of kings. We seem to have reestablished the divine right of Congress. And now we're getting back to the divine right of the president. Nevertheless, libertarians have a record to be proud of. We have been fighting ignorance, superstition, privilege, and power for many centuries. Brian Doherty wrote a great book. The New York Times ran a long review of it, which seemed kind of ignorant. And one of the things it said was, well, he complains, he's always telling you how great libertarianism is, but he doesn't tell you about the libertarians who haven't respected the rights of others. Really? What are those? Well, he says, Ayn Rand testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee. Most of you are too young to remember the era of HUAC. This was back when there were actual communists in America, and they were investigating them. Yes, it's true, Ayn Rand did testify, and some people would say you should not cooperate with a congressional witch hunt like that. But that's kind of rich coming from a newspaper that won a Pulitzer Prize for covering up the terror famine in Ukraine. All Ayn Rand said was there are communist ideas being put in American movies, but you shouldn't censor them. That's not the way you answer bad ideas. The New York Times won a Pulitzer Prize for Walter Duranty's reporting from Ukraine, and then their reporter Herbert Matthews played an important role in imposing Fidel Castro on the people of Cuba. So for them to suggest that some libertarian once said communism was a bad idea is a rich irony. Then they said, well, Murray Rothbard supported Strom Thurmond for president in 1948. Well, he sort of did. He was 22 years old, and it is embarrassing. And all those whose friends and forebears did not support the fellow traveling communist Henry Wallace in 1948 are entitled to criticize. And then the New York Times said, what about Milton Friedman? He advised the dictator of Chile, Pinochet, about how to have a better economy. Well, yes, that's what he did. He held a 45-minute meeting with a military dictator, and he told him if you follow the certain rules, you will have a better economy. So I just wonder, should he have refused to advise the head of Chile's government on how to lift the burden from its people? And I noticed that the New York Times did not criticize Friedman for having a much longer relationship with the communist government of China. He went to China several times, and he met at greater length with the leaders of China, and maybe in both Chile and China, he played some role in bringing those people out of the darkness and into a more modern world. Chile now has the fastest growing, most successful economy in Latin America, and China has brought more people out of poverty in the past generation than any country in history. Neither country is a libertarian paradise, but that's not a bad record. And then he said, finally, Brian Doherty, what about this guy who was an anti-Semite? And I read this review and I said, and I wrote this actually in a blog post at the time, despite 30 years in the libertarian movement and despite having read this book, I've never heard of this guy. But I go back, flipping through the index, flipping through the pages, and I finally find, oh yes, there's a reference to a guy who was an anti-Semite. And what did it say? It said that Leonard Read, one of the actual founding fathers of the libertarian movement, told people, don't have anything to do with this guy, he's an anti-Semite. So how does the New York Times know the guy's an anti-Semite? Because Leonard Read told people to stay away from him. So if that's the sum total of embarrassing libertarian moments, it's a pretty darn good record over 70 years or so. Modern liberals have to deal with the fact, not an embarrassing one, but a shameful one, that many of their forebears supported Stalin and the Communist Party, or were at least fellow travelers. As for conservatives, I could mention their long resistance to liberty and legal equality for blacks, women, and gays, but instead I'll just say George W. Bush and the Iraq War. In 70 years, libertarians have done nothing to compare to expressing support for limited government while also supporting Bush, his disastrous war, and his accumulation of unprecedented presidential power. So I go back to the point I made earlier. Libertarians have a record to be proud of and a record to build on.